Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about regulation in transportation industries and financial industries. And so this is where in our discussion of public economics and regulation, we start to look at case studies of actual real life situations of regulatory policy, regulation and deregulation of industries. And the industries we're looking at are transportation industries generally, specifically looking at trains, trucking, and airplanes, a little bit of boats, but not really on the homework assignment. And then talking about the energy region, talking about the case study of deregulation and regulation of energy in California. So let's get started. So the first example, or the first question on homework number 4 is, in what way is measuring market concentration of the airline industry different from measuring market concentration in other industries? And people gave a lot of really interesting answers here, but if you think about it, not all of them were terribly unique. So when you talk about high fixed costs associated, that's true of pretty much every industry we're talking about, right? If you compare it to trains or trucking or electricity or any natural monopoly, most utilities, right, water, it's going to be really similar. What makes the airline industry different is competition within markets. And so the idea here is it's not enough for there just to be a single market of the United States, right? Saying, hey, there are this number of airlines in the market post-deregulation. What really is going to tell us how competitive a market is not the national market, but the regional market. So going on a specific route is going to be the real measure of market, not the total federal market or the total national market or the world market, how many airlines there are in the world or in the US, but it's more about how many airlines go to this airport and that airport. And that's where it gets confusing, because there might be 10 or 20 airlines operating out of a lot of major cities, but there are plenty of rural destinations where there's only 1 or maybe 2 airlines, and that's going to be much less competitive, and we're going to see higher prices prevail and less competition. And so that's the big idea, is this idea that the market can be broken down into these sub-markets that are going to be have very different levels of competition depending on usually the size of the market, how many consumers there are in that market. So that's the big idea there. Question number 2 says, has airline deregulation made consumers better off? If so, which consumers, why or why not? And this one really and truly is up to you. You have to make this determination. So think about what we talked about with airline deregulation and what happened before and after. So before airline deregulation, firms could not compete over the dimension of price. And so prices were pretty much the same across all routes. So they competed through customer service. Now we see customer service has taken a dip. We see much more competition in terms of price. We see higher levels of price discrimination, right? Charging different consumers different prices. We see prices for rural routes be higher, urban routes be lower. We see more flights offered, but longer travel times because of the transition to the hub and spoke system. And so really it's going to depend on what you think is better for consumers. The other dimension that I haven't talked about yet, but is in the textbook and we've talked about in class, is the safety. Generally, we say that airlines have been pretty much the same level of safety that they were before deregulation. And so how you answer this question depends on what your interpretation of that data is and your perception. Do you think that the increased price discrimination is good or bad? Do you think the customer service change is good or bad? Do you think it's good to have more routes or bad to have longer flight times and more layovers? And so it truly is your question and your perception. Just make sure you back it up with for whom and why so that I can see your logic. Number 3, use the economic theories of regulation from Chapter 10 to explain the observed patterns of deregulation in the U.S. transportation sector. And again, it's a little bit up to interpretation, but you want to remember the 3, I guess technically there's 4 theories of regulation. The first one is normative theory as positive analysis. And that's this idea that consumer outcry leads to regulation. And it's not super well supported by the data, but we can see an example of this in some of these markets, right? So maybe in the railroads, right, the trains and the rail industry, there was both consumer outcry and firm outcry for regulation. So that could be NPT. It could also be capture theory, right? This idea that firms capture a regulatory agency and get regulation that supports them. The problem with capture theory is that the railroads argue that they were harmed by the regulation, so that might not work. It could be reformulated NPT, which just says that NPT is regulation that happens in response to consumer outcry and then is mismanaged. That could work. And you could use capture theory to explain at least some of the trucking regulations, right? So the trucking industry was regulated after the railroads were regulated, and they actually profited in the process because of the limits and the enforcement of firm entry. They saw pretty high profits and were able to reinvest and really grow as an industry. And so that seems to speak to the firms benefiting. But if you wanted my personal opinion, and you are entitled to whatever opinion you want so long as you can support it, I think the back and forth and the regulation and deregulation kind of fits the economic theory of regulation. And remember, the economic theory of regulation comes from that Stigler-Peltzman model, where it's about firms trying to maximize profits, consumers trying to get low prices, and what we're going to see is, I'm going to keep my train here because I want it, because I'm proud of it. What we're going to tend to expect to see in the Stigler-Peltzman model is that we're going to have, if you remember, price down here, and profits up here, and firm profits are going to be a function of price, whereas price goes up, profits go up to a point and then go down. And so firms will want the monopoly price, which is the profit maximizing price. Consumers will want the competitive price, which is the lowest or the zero economic cost price. And regulators will choose a price based on the support they receive, which is a function of profits and prices, right? It's based on basically keeping consumers happy and firms happy, depending on who gets the highest, who can give them the highest level of political support. And so the idea is the regulators are bouncing back and forth between these two preferences, the preferences of the firm and the preferences of consumers, depending on who has the loudest voice, who's the best organized, and who can offer the most political support. And so that'd be my opinion. But if you think you could argue another opinion, I would love to see it, because I think there's an argument to be made for each case. So that's number 3. Number 4, how does vertical unbundling allow for deregulation of the electricity industry? Can you think of how new technology might make vertical unbundling easier or more common? And so this gets back to this idea, and you can go back and review the slides on this one, where we see vertical unbundling is the idea that electricity generation is already bundled, vertical integration, like we saw with Alcoa, where there's the generation, the transmission, distribution, and retail. And vertical unbundling said, what if we separate those things out and separate the generation from the retail at some level, so that we can have multiple retailers of electricity coming from that single wholesale source? And that's how the restructuring was done in California. And the idea was, okay, yes, this generation of electricity is subject to massive economies of scale, super high fixed costs, very low per unit costs. So the generation has to be a monopoly, a natural monopoly, but the retail could be competitive. And so that restructuring in California said, let's split the retail into two, the utility and the non-utility provider, and try to create some competition. As we increase technology, we're seeing increase in battery technology, solar panel technology, renewable energy technology. We're seeing a lot of diversification of that generation component. And that's probably, I think it's fair to say, going to make unbundling more common and a little easier. All these new technologies are meaning that we can have more distributed generation, and that households can be less reliant on the grid, which is reliant on that wholesale generation. And so, if you're getting some portion of your electricity from solar panels or from a generator or something like that, then that's going to reduce that monopoly power and insert some competition into the market. And that's one of the big ideas from this whole class, is this idea that it's not just this binary, right? This dichotomy of monopoly and not monopoly, that there's a lot of space in between a true full natural monopoly and a true perfectly competitive market, and that there's lots of shades of gray of competition. So, last question, number 5. One argument about financial regulation is that growing regulations give financial institutions a false sense of security, driving them to pursue more risk. So the idea is that banks know if they get into really big trouble and there is a lot of systemic risk, that the federal government is going to not want financial institutions to fail, so they'll bail them out. And so there's this idea of okay, the worst case scenario is the Fed comes in and rescues us. That's a false sense of security, or maybe it's a fair sense of security, but it could induce more risk-taking behavior, and that's known. This is an example of a moral hazard problem. So, give an example of a moral hazard problem you've witnessed in life, in the media, or somewhere else outside of this example. And I'm going to give you one of my favorite examples that I think I talked about a little bit in class. It's an episode of Seinfeld. So, give me a second to pull that up. So, this is from yada 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 econ.com, and they have an index of the concepts that they try to explain with episodes of Seinfeld. In this episode, Jerry's car is stolen. So he rents a car, and the rental car company doesn't give him the one he wants, and so he says he's going to...
I'm in awe of his intellect. When he talks, it sounds like he's reading from one of his novels.
Owen March. I never heard of him.
Well, he's not a baseball player.
Yeah, that's true. Well, so it sounds like it's going pretty good.
Yeah. Well, there is one little problem.
What's that?
He's 66 years old. Next, please. Go. Go. Can I help you? Name, please.
Seinfeld. You made a reservation for a mid-size, and she's a small. I'm kidding around, of course.
Okay, let's see here.
66 years old?
Yeah, well, he's in perfect health. He works out. He's vibrant. You'd really like him.
Why do people always say that? I hate everybody. Why would I like him?
So what do you think? Could you go out with a 66-year-old woman?
Well, I'll tell you, she would have to be really vibrant. So vibrant, she'd be spinning.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have no midsize available at the moment.
I don't understand. I made a reservation. Do you have my reservation?
Yes, we do. Unfortunately, we ran out of cars.
But the reservation keeps the car here. That's why you have the reservations.
I know why we have reservations.
I don't think you do. If you did, I'd have a car. See, you know how to take the reservation, you just don't know how to hold the reservation. And that's really the most important part of the reservation, the holding. Anybody can just take them.
Let me speak with my supervisor.
Here we go. The supervisor. You know what she's saying over there?
What?
Hey, Marge, see those two people over there? They think I'm talking to you. So you pretend like you're talking to me. Okay, now you start talking.
Oh, you mean like this, so it looks like I'm saying something, but I'm not really saying anything at all?
Okay, now you say something else, and they won't yell at me because they thought I was checking with you.
Okay, I think that's enough. See you later.
I'm sorry, my supervisor says there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, it looked like you were in a real conversation over there.
But we do have a compact if you would like that.
Fine.
All right. Well, we have a blue Ford Escort for you, Mr. Seinfeld. Would you like insurance?
Yeah, you better give me the insurance because I am going to beat the hell out of this
Please, fill this out.
So that's the example. So basically the idea here is, all else aside, Jerry decides that if they give him the insurance, he can really abuse the car to get back at them. Would he do it if he didn't have the insurance? Of course not. But that's the principle of moral hazard, right? This idea that we behave in a riskier manner once we're insured, once we're protected. So that's an example. You can think about times you behaved in a riskier way because of some kind of insurance guarantee, promise, or backup plan. You could think about an example of a friend or a colleague or a family member, something from work, something from TV shows or something you've seen. But that's all I'm looking for is just an example from real life of a moral hazard. Okie dokie, that's it. That is homework assignment number 4. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time. Have a great one.